Yeah, I think it's all the above and it goes into layers, right? At the end of the day. If you're just starting out, you're greenhorn investing or you don't have much, that's where LLCs and insurance come into play. There's no point in building a Taj Mahal before you're ready for a Taj Mahal. But we can layer this stuff up. So risky assets, like, easy one to think about is investment properties, right? Real estate. Go directly into an LLC, get some insurance on it. You're going to start growing. You're going to start scaling.
You're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to and watching the Financial Survival Network. I'm your host, Kerry Lutz. Hey, in this day and age, if you have any assets, any wealth whatsoever, there are probably 10 people you don't even know about who are out to try to grab them from you, grab your assets, take your wealth, and doing it fully legally through the legal system. And Brian Bradley here, asset protection attorney, best-selling author, renowned educator in the legal and financial spheres. And, well, Brian, it's great to have you on here. So tell us, how big is the threat from all of these predators out to take your money?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Kerry, for having me on. And it's going to be a lot of fun. And we have a lot of, important things to go over. And I think like myth busting, a lot of misconceptions, breaking down the different rules of trust and how these can protect you or not. And, my book that you mentioned, Overexposed, I wrote because there never was kind of that horn book on what is the world of asset protection and the different layers and how do we go about creating it. So I decided, I might as well just write it myself and, use it as more of an educational method for individuals to go through, like what's a bunch of BS, what's not, how to start small, how to grow and scale into it. And kind of like what you were talking about is like, if we set the scene, one, asset protection, right, has to be done before you're getting sued, right? Like, it's not like something we can just jump into like, oh my God, my house burnt down. How do I get insurance for my house now to cover it? The rule of asset protection is exactly the same. If you're already getting sued, you're too far down the rabbit hole. These are things that you have to think about to set up beforehand for them to work. Otherwise, we're going to fall down the rabbit hole of fraud and fraudulent transfer. And to answer your question, right, on like what happened is we live in this sue happy nirvana. And to put some context to it, the legal system's drastically changed over the past 40 years. It's no longer about justice, but it's about creating divide and redistributing, your wealth from the haves, which is, you and your listeners, are the have-nots. It's basically, I think the term is Robin Hood economics. And in my book, I go over in depth the historical big changes that led us to this. But to quickly summarize the problem over the past 40 years, things that just didn't happen in the past or that weren't allowed to happen in the past, like contingency fee lawyers or law firm advertising, they're commonplace. And this created a cultural shift of a predatory legal system that is no longer about justice, but is now about profits. And our legal system is now run by trial lawyers and special interest groups who don't want to discourage lawsuits, but rather increase the size of a victim class. And then this is just creating a society of victims. We basically legislated out accountability and responsibility for our own actions. And this makes lawsuits an easy get-rich scheme, for those who want to try to play what my colleague used to call the lawsuit lottery. And it's a sad truth, but while attorneys, right, may stoke that fire that drives the American litigation engine, without the public's endless appetite for suing each other, there really wouldn't be a litigation crisis. And when we take a macroeconomic global look at everything, the big picture really is that on top of our destroyed legal and tort system, we have a global financial system that is structurally deep-rooted issues. We have, government-backed fiat currencies that are in question, and this includes the U.S. dollar, and a monetary policy that's really plain and simple, right? It's in our face, inflate or die. And then we got governments looking at deep and accessible pools of money and financing, meaning, your money, your assets, along with financial repression, monetary economic manipulation. And so this is the world we're living in and we're investing in. And so it makes it really hard to, what do we do to actually protect and keep our assets? And that's where modern day asset protection comes into play and, utilizing asset protection trust.
Well, like you said, Brian, the key is to set up your financial fortress before you need it rather than.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's a beautiful case on that point, actually. It's a 2010 case. It's called SEC versus Solo. And here's a situation, because I get this call all the time, and even though I talk about this and say, if you're already in a lawsuit, please, it's too late, right? But people need to understand. So this case really breaks down the importance of this point. So the court here found that the husband, Mr. Solo, made a fraudulent transfer after the SEC judgment was entered against him. So what he did was he assigned assets over to his wife's trust to protect them after the judgment, right? So this is just no bueno. This is just straight up fraud.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Solo was held in contempt of court, but there's a big but here. 100% of his assets were actually able to be protected. And I always use this case to demonstrate two things. One's the power of really strong trust, which we'll get into, probably a little bit. But what was horrible here is that he was held in contempt of court. But why? What did he do wrong? The second point of this case goes to the timing of setting up an asset protection plan, right? He transferred the assets too late. He was late to the game. He did this after the fact, after the lawsuit, after the judgment. And that was fraudulent, and that allowed the court to open up the door to hold him in civil contempt of court. So his assets were protected, but he opened up the door to be held in contempt of court. Potentially face imprisonment, depending upon the state, right? Correct. Yeah. So the big takeaway, from that is just this, all this stuff has to be set up beforehand, not after the fact. Like, just like even, like we were talking about a little bit, like Medicaid planning, for elders, is we got to do things before that 5 years look back period. And so, like, whenever we're trying to set up and preserve wealth or protect ourselves from lawsuits, you can't do it after the fact. It always has to be set up early and beforehand.
Okay. So family limited partnerships, trusts, LLCs, what is the best vehicle to accomplish all this, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, I think it's all the above, and it goes into layers, right? At the end of the day, if you're just starting out, you're greenhorn investing, or you don't have much, that's where LLCs and insurance come into play. There's no point in building a Taj Mahal before you're ready for a Taj Mahal. But we can layer this stuff up. So risky assets, like, easy one to think about is investment properties, right? Real estate. Go directly into an LLC. Get some insurance on it. You're going to start growing. You're going to start scaling. That's where management companies come into play. We utilize limited partnerships because there's just more that we can do with them. And limited partnerships separate out managers from owners. So it's a higher class level of protection than just another LLC. And then as you get to like that $1 million mark is generally when we're going to talk about the world of trust. And not all trusts are the same. And I think that people get really confused on, well, I have my revocable living trust, my estate plan, I'm good to go, I'm protected. And it's like, oh, sorry, that's the wrong type of trust. That's not going to protect you. You need the revocable living trust for medical directives, financial directives, beneficiaries of avoiding probate. But they're not going to protect you from, creditors and lawsuits. They don't have the teeth in them. That's where asset protection trusts come into play.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how good are these asset protection trusts, assuming you set it up before and not after the fact?
Yeah. So it really just comes down to, one, what state are you in? Because not all states recognize and have some sort of like self-settled spendthrift legislation. Like all asset protection trusts are self-settled. So if you live in, example, a state like California, well, California does not recognize self-settled spendthrift trust. They don't have the legislation. And then there's a case, Kilker versus Steelman, came down in 2012 that said, we're tired of all you California residents running off to another state like Nevada and creating a Nevada asset protection trust. You're not a resident of that state. We're not going to recognize it, and it doesn't work. And so you can't just go and jump around jurisdictional shop and say, well, I'm a resident of a state that doesn't have this, but this state does. So I'm going to go use that and bring the state laws to my state that I'm a resident of. So we got to look at what state that you're at. If you're a resident of like Nevada, yeah, we can utilize the Nevada Asset Protection Trust. How strong are they? Surprisingly, the purely domestic ones, they're not very strong. There's a lot of case law that's been coming around since the early 2000s. We got like Bailey versus Mordison, and Ray Huber, Dale versus Dale. And what all these cases are of domestic, like U.S.-based asset protection trust that have just been completely getting pierced. And those are on good facts. So then what do people do? Well, we got another option, right? Going purely offshore, the famous Cook Islands Trust, the strongest trust in the world, by far the gold standard of any type of asset protection trust, but they're expensive as heck. And it takes and you got to do like foreign disclosures, back to disclosures, 1035 days, very expensive to maintain. Most people, 99% of society, that's just way overkill. It's not worth it. Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of bridge this gap, right? That's where the best form of trust that I find is what's called a hybrid trust. We call it a bridge trust. What you're doing is taking that foreign trust for that strength and then domesticating it through the IRS for the domestic simplicity of tax purposes. Mm-hmm. And so we have the strength in the back pockets, domestic simplicity, which makes it cheaper to set up, easier to maintain. And then it's like a Swiss Army knife. What we need, when we need that strength, we have it. When we don't need it, it's in our back pocket and we can utilize it at that point in time. So really the gold standard nowadays for the last 30 years that most people haven't heard about are these hybrid asset protection trusts. And that would be kind of the route where most people would go. Once you hit that $1 million exposed net worth mark, I wouldn't have someone calling in and saying, hey, I'm just starting out in real estate or investing. Can I get a strong hybrid trust? No, that's way overkill for you. Start at the base, layer up, and then let the system grow and scale as you do.
All right. Hey, what about moving to Florida, Texas, getting out of places like California where you're a virtual target from every direction? Do you ever have clients do that?
No, I do. I don't think you're ever going to be able to like fully run from any type of judgment because even in Florida and Texas, you still have out of control judges who anytime you go into a trial, you don't know what's going to happen. It's not worth the risk. I think Florida and Texas have great benefits for like homestead exemptions and certain things like that. Like an exemption is the strongest thing you can have in the world, right? It's an exempt asset. You know, a great way to think about it was the famous football player O.J. Simpson, right? Who got, found not guilty for murdering his wife, lost a civil trial, but then they never were able to collect on him because his Florida mansion was homestead exempted. And then his NFL pension is ERISA exempted, protected. So he was never able to be collected on and all his assets were safe. So that just goes to the power of an exemption. But if you're in Florida and you're investing in other states, right, like California real estate or other states, you can't say, well, Your Honor, I'm a Florida resident. Like this is, apply Florida law when the injury is happening in California or New York or some other state.
Hey, what about the limitations on effectiveness of LLCs and partnerships?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misconceptions on LLCs. Like I like LLCs, but we need to remember like they're just the base layer, right? Like that's asset protection 101. And for some reason, I think that a lot of people think that all of a sudden, well, I created this LLC and this is my Dracula Slayer, I'm good to go. And they don't realize like the veils can be easily pierced. And then there's a lot of confusion on where do we even set these things up in, right? Like, do we go to Delaware, Wyoming, Texas, Nevada? And what we're really talking about, what I've been hinting on in some of this is just charging order protection and corporate veil piercing, which is really big, legal, fancy words. And what we have to remember is that one, LLCs began in the 70s with the goal of blending the elements of corporations and partnerships without the downside of double taxation, right? Like asset protection was never the actual end goals of LLCs. So by nature, they just aren't the strongest strategy. And then they offer a limited veil of protection. And that veil is good, right? It's better than nothing. It's better than just having everything in your own personal name, but it's fragile and it can be pierced. Just think of it like that thin, flimsy piece of fabric that covers the face of a bride on her wedding day. And so what people need to realize is there's this case in 2023, so just last year, that is a Supreme Court case. It's called Mallory versus Norfolk. And the Supreme Court upheld a Pennsylvania statute that forces companies to face litigation within the borders that is registered to do business. And I'm going to repeat that because it's actually really important. It forces companies to face litigation within the borders that is registered to do business in. So state courts are permitted to exercise now jurisdictions over registered foreign corporations that, let's say, are holding your real estate, just as if they're domestic corporations of that state. So running off to another state like Delaware or Wyoming or Nevada, and you're not a resident of those states, the courts are saying, sorry, now the states can come in and get jurisdiction over that. So we need to realize you're not going to get any beneficial use out of that LLC if you're not a resident of that state where it's holding the assets, because those states can just take the jurisdictional control.
Gotcha. So any place where you are, they can get you.
Correct.
All right. So the gold standard of it all?
The gold standard, I would say, layer this up over time, pick the proper jurisdiction, the assets go, in an LLC in the state that they're in, layer it up with a management company. We prefer limited partnerships. And then once you hit that, high, that 1 million net worth mark, top it off with a really strong hybrid trust. And that way we have the back pocket strength if we need it with the simplicity of the domestic. So the gold standard is that hybrid trust. It's just a matter of when in time, right, you get to that level. Right.
Okay. So family limited partnerships, though, still pretty tight?
Yeah, the family limited partnership, right, they can still be pierced. Don't get me wrong. It's what the benefit of a limited partnership, the family limited partnership over another LLC, is that we can put more assets in it. For one, like we can stuff cash, stocks, bonds, all of that non-risky stuff directly in there. But there's a built-in delineation or separation between managers and owners by statute. This is the only way that you can create a limited partnership, is saying the GP is the managing member, the LP is the owner of this, and you just cannot do that with an LLC because they're not created that way. And so what some firms try to do is get really creative with operating agreements. The problem when you do that with LLCs is you have to submit those operating agreements for judicial review. So when a judge is looking at your operating agreement of your LLC and saying, I'm sorry, this is not how LLCs are structured and set up. I don't agree with your operating agreement. Your veil is now pierced and it's not operating how it was intended. So the better thing is just use the proper entity, how it was structured and created from the beginning, which would be a limited partnership. Because then we can separate out the next layer, which would be the trust, have the trust own the limited partnership. You would be the managing member. And now everything by statute is properly legally structured.
All right. Well, I think you've given us really good exposure. Next time you come on, we'll talk about those Medicaid, Medicare trusts to avoid having all your assets taken if you fall ill and your insurance runs out or your Medicare runs out. These are real life problems here. If people want to find out more about you, Brian, connect with you on the web, how do you do that?
Yeah, they can jump on my website, www.btblegal.com. I use my website as an educational resource, and there's a lot of frequently asked questions and a lot of educational videos on there. Feel free to reach out to me, Brian, Brian, at btblegal.com. I do free consultations for people who listen on the show, so I'd rather have you get some good advice and then take it from there to where you need.
Hey, that's excellent. We appreciate that. Hey, got a question from Brian or myself, just shoot me an email, kl@kerrylutz.com. Hey, you will find his link in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Go there, subscribe for your free newsletter. Brian, appreciate you coming on, sharing your wisdom. We'll talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.